On Saturday, the 20th of January 1945, an exceptional event in the history of the United States took place. That day, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated to begin serving his fourth term as U.S. President. He had first been elected back in 1932 and had been in office since March 1933. Roosevelt, who is often known as FDR, was not only unusual in being appointed for a fourth term. His third term was also unique. No other figure in U.S. history has ever served more than 2 terms. Yet these were unusual times. America was at war. Millions of American soldiers and military personnel were overseas in the Pacific and Europe, and every aspect of life in the U.S. had changed. This was evident on the day of Roosevelt's fourth inauguration, which took place on the south portico of the White House, rather than at the Capitol building. The event was held with little fanfare owing to the general austerity imposed by the war. Many people might perceive Roosevelt's inauguration for a fourth time as overreach, and indeed the 22nd Amendment was passed in 1951 to prohibit anyone serving beyond 2 terms, in line with the tradition George Washington had set as America's first president. But few would argue against the idea that Roosevelt was one of America's greatest presidents. He also was not the only Roosevelt president. His cousin Theodore, or Teddy Roosevelt, had served as the 26th President of the United States between 1901 and 1909. This means that the Roosevelts are one of just 4 families to produce 2 presidents, along with the Adams family, the Harrisons, and the Bushes. Moreover, because FDR served 3 full terms and started a 4th, no family has held the White House for longer. This is the story of the most powerful family in American political history. It is fitting that a family which would play such a leading role in American life should have long roots in the country. The Roosevelts trace their lineage in America all the way back to the start of the colonial era, when their Dutch ancestors migrated to the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam from the Low Countries. The family ultimately hails from around Tolen, in the province of Zeeland, in the south of the Netherlands. A man by the name of Klaas Martensen van Roosevelt was born there in 1623. Klaas is a Dutch version of Nicholas. Martensen means son of Martin, while van Roosevelt is a topographical surname which means of the rose field. Hence his name transliterated as Nicholas, son of Martin of the rose field. Van Roosevelt indicates that a distant ancestor of the family had lived next to a field of roses, probably back in the High Middle Ages, when surnames came into widespread use in places such as the Low Countries. The Dutch began settling and colonizing the lower end of Manhattan Island and further up the Hudson River from 1625 onwards. They called the little town at the end of Manhattan New Amsterdam. Klaas van Roosevelt immigrated there at some point in the 1640s. The exact date is not entirely clear, but we know he was there by 1649. There, Klaas van Roosevelt owned a substantial farm north of the town, part of which included the land that the Empire State Building stands on today. Klaas and his wife Jannetje had 5 children that we know of in the 1650s and early 1660s. Klaas lived down to 1679, long enough to see England seize New Amsterdam from the Dutch in 1664, triggering the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and to rename it as New York. Eventually, English rule was cemented here, and it became one of the 13 colonies which would later form the United States in 1776. From amongst Klaas's children, his son Nicholas was the most important individual for the story of the Roosevelt family. There is a record of his baptism in New Amsterdam on the 2nd of October 1658, meaning he was almost certainly born in early October, as baptism was usually carried out within 48 hours of birth in early modern times. By the time his father died, and Nicholas was into his 20s, New York was firmly established as an English colony. In the early days of English rule, there had always been the possibility that the Dutch would try to seize it back, as there were 3 wars fought between the English and the Dutch between the 1650s and 1670s. By the 1680s, the international situation was changing. The English and the Dutch were now becoming firm allies against France, as they sought to check the expansionist ambitions of King Louis XIV of France. Therefore, older Dutch settler families like the von Roosevelts, whose loyalties had previously been suspected by the English government in New York, were accepted as subjects, and life took on a more regular shape there. Nicholas had spent some of his younger years living up the Hudson River as a fur trader. As the Dutch settlers became more acclimatized to English rule, he moved back to New York. It was he who first started adapting his name to Roosevelt, all in one word, and sounding slightly more anglicized. Nicholas had several sons and daughters. From among these, 2 stand out: Johannes and James Jacobus. Johannes was the founder of what became known as the Oyster Bay or Sagamore Hill Roosevelts. This branch of the family became associated with Oyster Bay on Long Island, and it was from this side that President Theodore Roosevelt would emerge. Jacobus was the patriarch of the Hyde Park Roosevelts, associated with Hyde Park, up the Hudson River in Dutchess County, not far from the town of Poughkeepsie. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a member of the Hyde Park Roosevelts. An often overlooked aspect of the history of the Roosevelts is that several of the members of the family were inventors. Take the example of Nicholas Jacobus Roosevelt. He was born in New York City on the 27th of December 1767. He was a grandson of Johannes Roosevelt, and so belonged to a wealthier part of the family. As a child, during the American Revolutionary War, he was removed from New York City and spent a large period of time with his siblings living at one of the Roosevelt properties further up the Hudson River, away from the often intense fighting between the British and colonials to control New York City. During these years, he began tinkering with building a paddle boat, which used a complex spring system to sail around the Hudson. This was the beginning of Nicholas Roosevelt's lifelong interest in engineering. As an adult in the 1790s, he paid close attention to the new technological breakthroughs around steam engines, manufacturing, and mining that were taking place in England during the earliest decades of the Industrial Revolution. He obtained commissions to build machines which helped in various mining operations in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. However, his greatest contribution to the world of engineering and industrial development came in the early 19th century, when he returned to working on boats. He partnered with Robert Fulton to develop the first practical steamboats using paddle wheels. These facilitated travel using some of the earliest steamboats on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and were an important stepping stone in the development of ocean-going steamboats. Roosevelt and Fulton eventually fell out over a patent dispute. Fulton is usually given the credit for the breakthrough in introducing paddle wheels, not least because he is a colourful figure who also built the first working submarine. But Nicholas was actually the man who proposed the paddle wheel design. Hence, before they began shaping America's politics, this member of the Roosevelts contributed to the development of the steamship, an invention which was critical in shaping the 19th century and the modern world. People living in New York and on the East Coast in the 19th century would have regularly read about other Roosevelts in the newspapers or heard about their activities. Nicholas's brother, James, for instance, was one of New York's wealthiest businessmen with a valuable import business. One of his sons, James John Roosevelt, was arguably the first Roosevelt of national political standing. James John was born in New York in 1795. As a young son, he did not inherit much of the family business and instead attended Columbia College and became a lawyer. This was a springboard into politics. He became an early member of the Democratic Party after it was founded in 1828 and campaigned energetically on behalf of Andrew Jackson to win the presidential election that same year. In 1841, James John was elected to Congress to represent New York's 3rd Congressional District in the House of Representatives. He held his seat for 2 years before returning to practicing law. His marriage also brought with it national political connections. James John married Cornelia Van Ness, the daughter of Cornelius Van Ness, the governor of Vermont between 1823 and 1826, and then Jackson's ambassador to Spain between 1829 and 1836. There were several other prominent Roosevelts in the 19th century. James Henry Roosevelt was a business figure and philanthropist who financed the establishment of Roosevelt Hospital in New York, known today as Mount Sinai West. Clinton Roosevelt was another noted inventor and lawyer. George Roosevelt was a hero of the American Civil War who was awarded the Medal of Honor for his conduct at the Battle of Gettysburg. The list goes on. James Roosevelt, the brother of the inventor Nicholas, left most of his fortune and business empire to his eldest son Cornelius. This made him one of the 5 or so wealthiest businessmen in New York City in the middle of the 19th century. This is important, for Cornelius was part of the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. This was the branch from which the first Roosevelt to enter the White House was descended. In this context, Teddy Roosevelt's rise was inevitably helped along by his family's wealth. Cornelius Roosevelt was born in 1794. He was a great-great-great-grandson of Claes von Rosenfeld, the founder of the Roosevelt dynasty in America, who had emigrated from the Netherlands back in the 1640s. Cornelius was an astute businessman. After he joined the company in the late 1810s, he convinced his father to begin shifting towards the importation of glass. This was at a time when homes were becoming easier to heat in winter, and people were building them with larger windows, which had previously been viewed as heat saps. In the panic of 1837, an economic crisis of the time, he bought a lot of Manhattan property at knockdown rates and profited when the market reinflated. Finally, in 1844, he was one of the founders of Chemical Bank, a direct forerunner of today's J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. Needless to say, when Cornelius died in 1871, he passed on an extensive estate to his children. One of these was Theodore Roosevelt Sr. He was the father of Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the man known as Teddy Roosevelt, who would become president in 1901. Theodore Sr. had an abortive political career himself. He was nominated to become the collector of the Port of New York, an important financial office in the city. This was in 1877, after Rutherford B. Hayes became president. Theodore Sr.'s nomination, however, was rejected by the Senate, and his political career was thus cut short. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., or Teddy as everyone knew him, was born on the 27th of October 1858. He was the great-great-great-great-great-grandson of Claes von Rosenfeld, and so was part of the 8th generation of the Roosevelts in America. Teddy was a sickly child who suffered from debilitating asthma. He became determined not to let his poor health limit him in life. Indeed, it was possibly because of this that he developed the sheer energy and drive which characterized his life. He also learned early on that physical activity seemed to help prevent asthmatic attacks in the long term. Roosevelt attended Harvard as a young man, excelling in studying the classics and history. He would go on to become an acclaimed writer, with his The Naval War of 1812, published in 2 parts in 1882, being a major commercial and critical success that launched him as a history writer. By then, he was a wealthy man. After inheriting much of his father's wealth on his premature death in 1878. 2 years later, he spent a chunk of the money he had inherited in purchasing an estate at Oyster Bay on Long Island. In the years that followed, he had a large summer retreat built there known as Sagamore Hill. It would later become a kind of summer White House when Roosevelt was president. It is for this reason that this branch of the Roosevelt family became known as the Oyster Bay or Sagamore Hill Roosevelts. However, Teddy lost most of his money after he moved out west to establish a large cattle ranch in the Dakotas. The winter of 1886 was extremely bitter in the Great Plains, and a large proportion of Roosevelt's herd froze to death. He was able to fall back, though, on writing, and return to the East Coast. By the 1890s, he was successfully entering New York politics and became New York City Police Commissioner between 1895 and 1897. National politics was now beckoning for Roosevelt. He was a figure whose books had made him a well-known individual before he ever tried to make it in Washington. In 1897, he was appointed as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy by President William McKinley. This was despite him having supported McKinley's rival to become the Republican Party's candidate the previous year, Thomas Brackett Reed. When the USS Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor during Spanish efforts to quell a revolt in its colony of Cuba in February 1898, Roosevelt, an advocate of American imperialism, forcefully backed war with Spain. This clashed with McKinley's desire for a diplomatic solution. In the end, the war party won out, and the short Spanish-American War began. Roosevelt resigned his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy to personally lead a ragtag division of men to invade Cuba. This was an expedition that he narrated in his best-selling memoir, The Rough Riders, published in 1899. By the time the book was published, the war with Spain was over, with the US claiming control over Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Roosevelt's public profile was bolstered by the expedition, and he returned to America to be immediately elected as Governor of New York. He held the position for 2 years. His tenure of the office was ultimately cut short by the death in office of McKinley's vice president, Garrett Hobart. Needing a new vice presidential candidate for the 1900 election, McKinley was convinced to put Roosevelt on the ticket. His energetic campaigning and popularity with the public contributed in part to McKinley's comfortable victory. Roosevelt was sworn in as McKinley's vice president on the 4th of March 1901. Less than 7 months later, he became the 26th President of the United States after McKinley met with an untimely death by assassination. He had become the 3rd president to be assassinated in a period of just 36 years, after Abraham Lincoln and James Garfield. McKinley was shot by an anarchist named Leon Czolgosz and died 8 days later from a gangrenous infection in the wound. Teddy Roosevelt was an ambitious president. Despite coming from a wealthy and privileged background and being an unrepentant imperialist who viewed America as destined to dominate the Western Hemisphere and become a global power, he was also determined to cut the great titans of American industry and banking down to size. In the second half of the 19th century, a small cohort of businessmen, industrialists, and bankers had acquired enormous power in the US. These men included the oil magnate John D. Rockefeller, the banker John Pierpont Morgan, and the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. Such was their influence and the perception that they were monopolizing the wealth of American society into their hands that they became known as the robber barons. Roosevelt made it clear that he was going to cut them down to size and redistribute the nation's wealth to the wider mass of society. He articulated this as offering the American people a square deal, whereby he would break up the monopolies, protect the country's resources, and redistribute wealth to a greater extent. This was a populist message at a time when millions of people were streaming into America from Europe and living in sprawling tenements in cities like New York in appalling poverty. At the same time, multimillionaires, billionaires in modern terms, were growing wealthier by the minute. Roosevelt's policies continued the progressive program of presidents like Grover Cleveland and shaped US economic policy for the first half of the 20th century. Ironically though, the greatest success of Teddy Roosevelt's policies were achieved in 1911, 2 years after he left office. It was only then that Rockefeller's Standard Oil was broken up into 34 different companies, thus ending its monopoly control over the US oil industry. Roosevelt's Square Deal and the efforts to reduce the power of the robber barons are typically viewed, in retrospect, as decent measures designed to improve the appalling inequality of US society at the dawn of the 20th century. That said, they shouldn't be viewed through an overly rosy prism. Roosevelt's 8 years in office were characterized by a lot of division and violence in American life, and a major economic crisis. There had been massive labor strikes in the late 19th century, such as the Homestead Strike of 1892 and the Pullman Strike of 1894. These had sometimes involved hundreds of thousands of workers and had resulted in bloodshed and loss of life. Such disorder continued into Roosevelt's time as president. In May 1902, the anthracite coal strike began in eastern Pennsylvania. It went on for over 6 months and involved over 100,000 workers. What was different about this was that Roosevelt intervened directly. Previous presidents had viewed large labor disputes as an issue to be resolved between workers and their representatives and their employers. Roosevelt appointed a commission to mediate. The strikes in Pennsylvania ended amicably, and workers received a pay increase and a reduction in their work hours. However, other strikes were not resolved so cleanly. In the case of the Colorado labor strikes of 1903 and 1904, the strikes became violent. Roosevelt resisted calls to send in the army and ended up clashing with the governor of Colorado, James Peabody, who sent in the National Guard to brutally suppress the strikes. Evidently, Roosevelt's handling of these matters, as messy as the situation became in Colorado, was viewed favorably by workers and the common people. When the 1904 US presidential election was held on the 8th of November, he comfortably won the election with over 7.5 million votes compared to 5 million votes of the Democratic Party candidate, Alton Parker. Roosevelt's foreign policy was even more successful than his domestic policy. His imperialist ambitions were seen in relation to 2 countries, Venezuela and Panama. In 1902, the government of Venezuela basically reneged on its considerable foreign debts to Britain, France, Germany, and other countries. The Monroe Doctrine, articulated by President James Monroe all the way back in 1823, had stated that the United States considered the Western Hemisphere to be its sphere of influence, in which it had a right to oppose European interventions. Thus, when the Europeans, particularly the Germans, sent naval forces to blockade Venezuela's ports until it began paying its debts, the argument was that these powers were breaching the Monroe Doctrine. Roosevelt initially prevaricated, as there had been no land invasion of Venezuela. Eventually, however, he began pressuring the Germans and forced them to abandon the blockade in 1903. A year later, he added the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, during his State of the Union address to Congress. This stated that the Monroe Doctrine could include the USA's willingness to intervene to manage the debts of Latin American nations where they might compromise US interests. Elsewhere, in 1904, the US took over the project to build the Panama Canal from the French. This was a project that they would see through to completion in 1914. Roosevelt's finest hour on the international stage, though, came in his second term when he mediated the peace negotiations between Russia and Japan following the short Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. This resulted in the Treaty of Portsmouth, which was signed in Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Maine in September 1905. For his role in ending the conflict, Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. Roosevelt is known for being one of the 4 men depicted on Mount Rushmore today. His imprint on popular culture is much wider in a way that is frequently overlooked. The teddy bear, of which billions of units have been produced since the start of the 20th century, is modeled after an incident involving Roosevelt. In November 1902, he was in Mississippi on a hunting trip with the state governor. When nothing was caught, officials decided to have a wounded bear tied up for him to shoot. Though Roosevelt was a big game hunter, he found the idea of shooting something that he hadn't hunted and which was tied up for him to shoot distasteful. He refused to carry out the act simply for a staged photo opportunity. News of the event spread quickly, and a cartoon was published in the Washington Post which depicted the bear as a friendly cub and with the title, "Drawing the Line in Mississippi." Morris Mitchtom, a toy maker in New York, then decided to produce a stuffed toy inspired by the event. He advertised it in his shop window as Teddy's Bear. It was basically a bear cub, but with exaggerated features like wide eyes and so forth, to make it more friendly looking for children. Over time, as the idea spread, Teddy's Bear turned into the teddy bear and became a way of referring to virtually any stuffed toy depicting a bear. Billions of teddy bears are being sold a century and a quarter later. Roosevelt probably wasn't delighted. He actually didn't like being called Teddy himself and preferred to be called Theodore. Edith and Teddy's time in the White House and in Washington was seemingly nearing an end in 1908. There was no term limit built into the US Constitution at this time. Instead, the idea that no president would serve more than 2 terms was a tradition which had been established by George Washington and honored by every president since. Teddy agreed on the basis of the tradition not to stand for re-election in the 1908 presidential election, although there was a grey area in his case. Theoretically, he had only ever been elected as president once in 1904, and only served 1 full 4-year term between early 1905 and early 1909. McKinley had won the 1900 election, and Roosevelt had been vice president for a small part of that term. This distinction would become an issue years later. In 1908, Roosevelt decided he would not run again. In any event, he had recently dealt with an economic crisis, the Panic of 1907, which had perhaps dented his popularity slightly as Americans felt the damage in their pockets. This was despite the fact that his successor as the Republican candidate, William Howard Taft, won the election comfortably in the end. Ever active, Roosevelt immediately headed off to Africa to lead an expedition on behalf of the Smithsonian Institution across much of the continent, from Kenya to the Congo, and then up the River Nile. He returned to America in the summer of 1910, and a few months later became the first US president, former or serving, to fly in an airplane. Roosevelt's Africa expedition and his feats in the sky all pointed towards his undiminished energy even as he entered his 50s. He was also disconcerted by the policies being pursued by President Taft, an individual who Roosevelt had largely picked as his successor back in 1908. It's unclear exactly when Teddy decided that he would renege on his promise not to seek another term as president, but the decision of a group of Ohio Republicans in November 1911 to endorse him as their preferred candidate in the 1912 U.S. presidential election brought the issue out into the open. In the first weeks of 1912, Roosevelt began publicly stating that if the party and the people wanted him back, he would run. Hence, he entered the race, challenging Taft as the incumbent, along with Robert La Follette. The process, which played out in the months that followed, is without equal in American political history. Roosevelt garnered more votes during the primaries and caucuses. The system of electing a Republican candidate was evolving at the time, and nobody was sure who would eventually gain the nomination. A large portion of the Republican Party establishment closed ranks behind Taft, unhappy at Teddy's decision to renege on his promise not to seek a third term. In the end, when the Republican Party convention was held in Chicago in mid-June 1912, Taft gained the nomination. Still, the result was far from conclusive, as many delegates remained undecided, and Roosevelt's supporters ultimately decided to abstain in the final votes. Instead, Roosevelt quickly formed the Progressive Party, better known colloquially as the Bull Moose Party, and contested the election as a third-party candidate. It is a sign of his immense popularity in America that despite splitting the Republican vote, Roosevelt still acquired over 4 million votes and 27% of the vote. He ultimately finished ahead of Taft, but lost to the Democratic Party candidate, Woodrow Wilson. Had the Republican Party vote not been split and Roosevelt chosen as their candidate, he would have won a third term. Roosevelt didn't mourn his loss in the 1912 presidential election for long. He threw himself into the next challenge. Back in 1909, the Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon had discovered the headwaters of the Amazon River. Following up on this, in December 1913, Roosevelt and Rondon led an expedition up the River of Doubt, a tributary of the Arapuana River, part of the wider complex of rivers that form the Amazon basin. They explored the region and conducted a scientific survey down to the late spring of 1914. Within weeks after his return to the US, Europe was ablaze with a diplomatic crisis following the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The First World War broke out in late July. From the start of it, Roosevelt was an ardent supporter of the US allying with Britain and France against Germany. When the sinking of American ships in the Atlantic by the Germans finally led to US entry into the war in April 1917, Roosevelt lobbied to lead the first American expeditionary force to France, imagining he could relive the glory days of the Rough Riders in Cuba 19 years earlier. However, Roosevelt was pushing 60, and Wilson blocked his efforts. Instead, Roosevelt spent the end of the war advocating for a closer relationship with Britain once the conflict was over, and for an international organization to mediate relations between the world's nations after the war. Teddy would ultimately never live to see the League of Nations established in 1920. He died in his sleep at home at Sagamore Hill from a pulmonary embolism on the night of the 6th of January 1919. The serving vice president at the time, Thomas Marshall, famously quipped that, quote, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." Teddy Roosevelt was dead. Yet even as the old lion was being laid to rest, another Roosevelt was emerging to take his place. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a scion of the Hyde Park Roosevelts. He was a great-great-great-great-grandson of Claes von Rosenfeld, the founder of the family's presence in New York back in the 1640s. His great-great-grandfather, Isaac Roosevelt, had been a leading opponent of British rule in New York during the American Revolutionary War. Isaac was a member of the New York State Senate for most of the period between 1777 and 1792, and also served as the president of the Bank of New York between 1786 and 1791. Franklin's grandfather, another Isaac, was a relatively introverted character who withdrew from New York life and instead became a farmer upstate at Hyde Park. He built Isaac Roosevelt House there, a fine example of a federal-style country house. It is still standing today and is on the National Register of Historic Places. Franklin would spend a considerable amount of time there during his childhood years, at which time his Uncle John owned the house. Franklin's father was James Roosevelt, known as Squire James. This nickname was on account of his love of horse breeding and the perception of him as a country squire living on an estate in rural New York. He was involved with the Democratic Party throughout his life, yet despite frequent proposals to appoint him to a middling office within the government of President Grover Cleveland and other senior Democratic politicians, Squire James largely lived out his life as a man of leisure at Hyde Park, based on inherited family wealth. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on the 30th of January 1882. Squire James was in his mid-50s by then, and Franklin was born of his second marriage to Sarah Delano, a woman 26 years his junior. Franklin was given her maiden name as his middle name, a common practice in Gilded Age America. His childhood was shaped by his protective mother, as Franklin was her only child. He attended Harvard, where he studied history, and then went on to Columbia Law School in 1904. Although he practiced law for a time in New York City, he was greatly impressed by the career of his Oyster Bay cousin, Teddy, who was then president, and decided he too wanted to enter politics. Franklin followed the Hyde Park tradition of supporting the Democratic Party and obtained a position representing the party within the New York State Senate in 1911. 2 years later, he was made Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the administration of Woodrow Wilson, the same position Teddy had first held in Washington 16 years earlier, when McKinley first became president. By then, he had married Eleanor Roosevelt, his fifth cousin, and started a family. Franklin was unfaithful, and the marriage never recovered from his affair with a secretary, Lucy Mercer. This occurred in the mid-1910s while Roosevelt served in Washington. The affair didn't, however, result in divorce, and Eleanor played a major role in Franklin's career for decades to come. Their peculiar relationship was made even more complex by Roosevelt's ill health. On the 10th of August 1921, while vacationing in Maine, Franklin started to come down with a fever and nausea. In the days that followed, his condition deteriorated and he eventually developed paralysis in his legs. In the weeks that followed, there was a wave of different health issues. He would recover from some, but he never walked unaided again and suffered from numerous other health complications for the remainder of his life. It is typically believed that Roosevelt contracted polio in August 1921, though the evidence is not conclusive, and it could also have been Guillain-Barré syndrome, a very rare autoimmune disorder where the body begins attacking the central nervous system. Franklin spent the next several years trying to recover his health. He reached the stage where several of the very serious symptoms he was suffering from, including blood clots, ulcers, and urinary retention, abated to a degree. However, he never regained the use of his legs. In the 1920s, it was considered out of the question for an individual who was confined to a wheelchair to try to run for elected office. Roosevelt consequently began training himself to walk using a set of large iron braces which were fitted over his legs and underneath his pants. Through this means he was able to move short distances with the appearance of walking stiffly. He could also stand at a podium to deliver a speech. In 1924, he made his first political appearance in years at the Democratic National Convention, where he unsuccessfully endorsed the Irish-American governor of New York to be the Democratic candidate in the presidential election that year. He repeated his endorsement of Smith in 1928, and this time Smith became the party's candidate. In turn, Roosevelt was lined up to succeed Smith as the governor of New York. He won the election and entered office on New Year's Day 1929. He was consequently the serving governor of the state when the Wall Street crash occurred in October 1929. Smith had lost the election a year earlier, and the Republican victor, President Herbert Hoover, proved the wrong man to deal with the Great Depression that followed. Hoover introduced protectionist tariffs that further damaged the U.S. economy. When the 1932 election rolled round, Roosevelt was chosen as the Democratic Party's candidate to try to unseat Hoover. He did so with ease, acquiring 23 million votes to Hoover's 16 and sweeping the Electoral College by 472 votes to 59. At 51 years of age, FDR entered the White House, 24 years after Cousin Teddy had left it. Though they led different political parties as president, FDR had no reservations about alluding to his cousin's legacy in framing his policies. He invoked the spirit of Teddy's Square Deal when he told the American people that he was going to give them a new deal that would lift the country out of the Great Depression. That's exactly what he did. The first 100 days of FDR's presidency in 1933 were amongst the most energetic in American presidential history. He set up a range of new government bodies to initiate a massive infrastructure and public building program. In the course of the 1930s, this put millions of American men back to work, building houses, bridges, schools, hospitals, and roads. FDR was also determined that the kind of speculative financial activity which had characterized Wall Street in the 1920s and had led to the crash in 1929 should not be allowed to happen again, at least not in his lifetime. Regulations were introduced that curbed Wall Street's worst habits for a half a century. More broadly, the New Deal aimed to create a middle-class society, one in which people were able to earn a decent living, buy a home, and raise a family, if they worked hard and did the right thing. It not only lifted America out of the Great Depression, it shaped the post-war prosperity of America down to the end of the 1960s. The Great Depression was being solved in an altogether different manner in Europe. During the 1930s, fascist and corporatist groups seized power in Germany, Austria, Spain, and Portugal. In Germany, the Nazis and Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933 with the specific goal of creating a new German Reich, or empire, that would cover much of Europe. In the end, the Nazis' expansion into Poland in September 1939 triggered a war for which Britain and France were unprepared. The Low Countries and France were conquered in the summer of 1940, leaving Britain largely on its own against German forces. Prime Minister Winston Churchill reached out to Roosevelt and appealed to their two countries' common background as English-speaking, democratic nations with similar values. Roosevelt was anxious to join the fight against Nazism, but public opinion in the US was opposed to becoming involved in what was viewed as a European conflict. FDR did begin to send large amounts of aid to Britain via the Lend-Lease program. In the midst of this, Roosevelt also decided, just like his cousin Teddy in 1912, that he wanted to serve a third term as president. He justified this break with the tradition set by George Washington on the basis that there was an emergency situation given the war in Europe. Clearly, the American people agreed. Roosevelt obtained 5 million more votes than his opponent, Wendell Willkie, and received 449 Electoral College votes to Willkie's 82. Despite the justification for his actions, there was an implied criticism of Roosevelt's position which came after the war. By 1945, Roosevelt had stood for election and won a fourth term as president. Although Roosevelt died just 82 days after his fourth inauguration, the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was enshrined in law in 1951, stating that no future president could serve more than 2 terms. Back in 1939, Roosevelt was anxious to bring the U.S. into the war from its earliest days. However, he was unable to overcome the isolationist streak in American society. It took a shock to the system to pull the US into the war. On the 7th of December 1941, the Japanese attacked the US Pacific Fleet at anchor at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. At the same time, they also attacked the Philippines and Britain's colonies in Southeast Asia. The following day, Roosevelt delivered a famous speech before Congress and the nation, in which he declared the 7th of December to be, quote, "a date which will live in infamy." 33 minutes later, the US declared war on Japan. They allied with Britain and its Commonwealth allies, as well as the Soviet Union, which had been invaded in late June 1941 by Nazi Germany. Churchill convinced Roosevelt of the strategic imperative of focusing on defeating the Germans in Europe and North Africa first, before dealing with the Japanese. Roosevelt conceded this was the best approach, while also committing large resources to the war in the Pacific. A series of initiatives were launched, such as the Doolittle Raid, a bombing mission against Tokyo on the 18th of April 1942, in order to bolster the morale of the American people. By the end of 1942, the Russians had forced the Germans to a complete halt. By 1943, they had started pushing them back westwards. Much of the fighting that year had centered on the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. In this respect, it was significant that the Americans provided the Soviets with over 7,000 tanks during the course of the war. Of course, Roosevelt wasn't managing all of this himself. He was a CEO of sorts, overseeing subordinates who carried out the day-to-day of creating the war economy. He was immensely busy in other ways. As the war went on, there were frequent conferences of Allied leaders. The first of these was in Washington just 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Once Operation Torch was launched to win the North Africa campaign in November 1942, the first major international Allied conference was held in Casablanca in Morocco in January 1943. Other major conferences followed, including the Quebec Conference of August 1943, the Cairo Conference of November 1943, and the Tehran Conference a few weeks later. The conference at Bretton Woods took place in July 1944 and, more famously, the Yalta Conference occurred in February 1945. These events weren't just about military planning and strategy. The post-war world order was being planned at these conferences. The travel involved was difficult for Roosevelt, whose health was declining further under the strain of the war. His presence at Tehran and Yalta was especially valuable, as he ended up acting as a mediator between Churchill and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Stalin was clamoring to claim as much of Europe for the Soviets after the war as possible. Churchill was equally determined that countries like Greece and Poland would remain within the Western sphere of influence. Meanwhile, despite the wartime emergency, on the 7th of November 1944, a new presidential election was held. Roosevelt won again, defeating Thomas E. Dewey by 432 Electoral College votes to just 99, although the popular vote percentage was closer than this landslide suggests. Ultimately, Roosevelt would only serve less than 3 months of his fourth term. On the 12th of April 1945, after years of ill health that he had soldiered through, he died at 63 years of age. He was replaced by his vice president, Harry Truman. Less than 4 weeks after Roosevelt's death, the Nazis surrendered in Europe as Germany and its capital Berlin were overrun. The war with the Japanese lasted slightly longer, ultimately culminating in the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Franklin Roosevelt's death took many by surprise. The extent of his illness had been covered up for years. Despite serving as the President of the United States for over 12 years, during most of that time, Roosevelt was almost never seen in public in his wheelchair. His image was carefully curated to avoid letting the American people know how sick he was. This was not the only aspect of his life which was stage managed. His marriage, too, was also presented favorably, to a considerable degree. Franklin and Eleanor's relationship had never recovered fully from his affair with Lucy Mercer in the 1910s. This was not helped by the fact that he maintained occasional contact with Mercer for the rest of his life, even after she married in 1920. Lucy, for instance, visited Franklin just days before he died. Her own husband had died the previous year. This made Eleanor's life, as the longest-serving First Lady in U.S. history, difficult. She is a woman worthy of recognition as more than just Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife. As First Lady, she championed many causes that were important to her, including the burgeoning civil rights movement. Eleanor even held press conferences occasionally, wrote a newspaper column, appeared on the radio, and regularly gave speeches. After the war ended and following the passing of Franklin, Eleanor Roosevelt took up the mantle of what had been a long-standing Roosevelt cause, the idea that the U.S. should join the United Nations. This view of the country as aspiring to play a leading role in the world had first been championed by Teddy, but the United States had never actually joined the League of Nations. Now, with the war over, Eleanor worked to ensure that the US did join the United Nations that replaced it. She became the first chair of the UN Commission on Human Rights and helped draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Right up until her death in 1962, at 78 years of age, she was still working, serving as a chair of the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women in the government of President John F. Kennedy. In the middle of the 20th century, there was a view that the Roosevelts might continue to play a leading role in U.S. politics for decades to come. After all, Teddy and Franklin had occupied the White House for 20 years in total between 1901 and 1945. Additionally, there were new generations of Roosevelts who seemed to be rising up the ladder of national politics. Teddy's son, Theodore Roosevelt III, was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the government of President Warren Harding in the early 1920s, and later served as governor of both Puerto Rico and the Philippines under President Hoover. His further promotion was stymied as the Republicans lost power in 1933, and he died in 1944 of a heart attack in France after D-Day. A further descendant, Theodore Roosevelt V, is a prominent banker today, who has taken an interest in politics from an environmental perspective, though without entering politics directly. On Franklin's side, one of his sons, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., followed most closely in his father's footsteps. After serving in the Second World War, he entered Congress in 1949 as a member of the House of Representatives for New York's 20th Congressional District. He twice attempted to run to become governor of New York, a position that had acted as a stepping stone to the White House for both Teddy and Franklin. but Franklin Jr. was unsuccessful. He obtained the post of Under-Secretary of Commerce in the administration of President Kennedy in 1963. Thereafter, his political career fizzled out. Another of FDR's sons, James, represented California in the House of Representatives until 1965. Following this, the Roosevelts faded from national politics. The Roosevelts have a claim to being the most important dynasty in the history of the United States. Their story in North America is nearly as old as that of European colonization there. The founder of the family, Claes van Rosenfeld, arrived at what was then known as New Amsterdam from the Dutch Republic in the 1640s. Unlike the founders of other Dutch-American dynasties in America, like the Vanderbilts, the Roosevelts were important and powerful individuals within what soon became New York, under English rule from the earliest days of the colony. By the 18th century, the family had split into two main groups. These were the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, later associated with Sagamore Hill on the north shore of Long Island, and the Hyde Park Roosevelts further upstate along the Hudson River near Poughkeepsie. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the two branches of the family produced businessmen, bankers, state politicians, inventors, and scientists. Long before they burst onto the national stage, the Roosevelts were an extremely important family within New York society. Nevertheless, it was two figures who have made them synonymous with American politics: Theodore Teddy Roosevelt and his cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, better known simply as FDR. In 1901, when President McKinley was assassinated, Teddy was elevated to the presidency. His entry into the Oval Office might have been an accidental byproduct of a political crime to begin with, but he subsequently emerged as one of the most consequential presidents in American history, tackling the robber barons at home and striving to establish the United States as an emergent global power abroad. He adorns Mount Rushmore, alongside Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln as a result. Still, when it comes to modern-day votes on who has been the greatest president in U.S. history, it is his cousin Franklin, who often comes top of the pile. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is revered next to Washington and Lincoln. Arguably, FDR eclipsed these other figures, as great as their accomplishments were. Not only did he lift the United States out of the Great Depression in the 1930s, but from 1941, he was America's wartime leader against both the threat of Nazism and that posed by the Empire of Japan. No other leader in U.S. presidential history has led the country through two crises of this magnitude. Although they have faded from the national stage since FDR's time, they remain a highly significant family in the history of American political life. What do you think of the Roosevelts? Was this the greatest political dynasty in American history? Or was there a dangerous tendency in the Roosevelts to try to cling to power, as exhibited in Teddy's founding of the Bull Moose Party, to try to win a third term as president, and FDR being the only man to serve a third, then a fourth term as President of the United States? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.